The lecture hall aboard the Concordance of Worlds held 43 students from 11 different species and one human. That one human, Joe, was the reason Professor Kalin had developed a mild but persistent headache over the past 3 academic cycles. It wasn't that Joe was disruptive. Not exactly. It was more that Joe asked questions that made the entire class go very, very quiet. Today was survival biology. Kalin had been teaching it for 30 years. He'd refined the curriculum to a precise, elegant structure. The evolutionary pressures that shaped prey instincts, the neurological basis of threat response, the statistical survival advantages of collective evasion behavior. It was thorough. It was comprehensive. He had never once felt the need to define which predators he meant. Now, Kalin said, gesturing toward the holographic display behind him. A rotating model of a Vreth stalker, all 6 limbs and photoreceptive camouflage. The fundamental prey response evolved primarily in opposition to ambush predators of this classification. Bilateral sensory organs, forward-facing attack trajectory, olfactory hunting. Your instincts, regardless of species, were shaped by something that looked, broadly, like this. He tapped the display. The Vreth rotated. New York, a pale Thessian student with 3 sets of arms folded neatly across her chest, raised her primary hand. Professor, is this model also applicable to pack hunters? The Grethkind pursue in coordinated relay formations. Excellent question. Yes, we'll cover distributed pursuit in the second half of the session. Which species? The voice came from the middle row. Quiet. Almost polite. Joe. Kalin turned slowly. The human was leaning forward in the curved seat, stylus tapping against the desk in that particular rhythm that Kalin had come to recognize as genuine curiosity, not challenge. Joe's face was open, attentive, and completely serious. I'm sorry, Kalin said. Which species are we talking about evading? Joe said. Like, when you say the prey response, who's the prey? When you say the predator, who's the predator? Because you've got students here from 11 species, and I'm trying to figure out which side of this chart most of us are supposed to be on. The class went quiet. Me, a Durathi student whose bioluminescent patches had been flickering with polite interest all morning, went completely dark. Day, one of 2 Halvari in the room, exchanged a glance with their clustermate High. The glance communicated something that didn't translate well to most other species, but loosely meant. Here we go. Wa, the only Creethian in the class, made a very small sound that was technically inaudible to most species present, but which Joe apparently heard, because Joe looked directly at Wa and nodded slightly, as if in acknowledgement. Kalin set down his stylus. The framework is universal, Joe. The principle of predator evasion. Right, but Durathi are ambush hunters, Joe said, gesturing toward me without any apparent malice. No offense. Me's bioluminescence flickered back on. A slow, deep pulse. None taken. We are. And Halvari. Joe glanced at Day and High. Pack cooperative pursuit, right? Relay formation like New York was asking about. Day said, with great dignity, we prefer to say collaborative tracking. Sure. And Creethians. Joe looked at Wu again. I did the reading. Creethians evolved in an ecosystem where they were prey to 4 distinct predator species simultaneously, which is why the cluster defense reflex is so strong and why was been sitting with their back to the wall since day 1. A pause. No offense, Wa. Wa made the small inaudible sound again. This time it conveyed something like, I appreciate being seen. The class had gone from quiet to completely, profoundly still. Kalin said, carefully, your point being? Joe leaned back. My point being that the framework you're teaching assumes a universal prey-predator binary, but you've got ambush hunters, pack hunters, and prey specialist species all in the same room, and they probably didn't all evolve the same evasion responses. So when you say the prey response, I want to know, prey response to what, and useful for whom? Because I feel like New York's instincts and Wa's instincts look pretty different, and maybe that matters. Professor Kalin looked at his 43 students. 43 students looked back at him with varying degrees of shock, recognition, and, in Me's case, a slow, admiring pulse of bioluminescence that he was fairly sure meant the mammal has a point. He thought about his 30 years of curriculum. He thought about the elegant, unified framework he'd spent 3 academic cycles perfecting. He thought about how no student, in 30 years, had ever asked him to disaggregate the data by which direction the teeth were pointing. This, Kalen said slowly, is going to require a restructure. The after session in the hall lasted longer than the session. What found Joe by the door, cluster limbs arranged in the Crethean configuration that indicated I want to speak, but I am unsure of the social protocol. Joe waited. You noticed, was said finally, in the careful, precise standard that Cretheans used when they were being deliberate. The wall. First day, Joe said. You clocked every exit before you sat down. I recognized it because, a small pause. We do that too. Was limbs shifted? Humans were prey? Humans were everything, Joe said, with a kind of easy directness that was found, despite themselves, deeply comfortable. Prey, predator, scavenger, pack hunter, ambush hunter. We don't fit the binary cleanly. We were chased by things with claws, and we chased things with claws, and sometimes we ate whatever was already dead. Depends on the century, depends on the continent. Joe shrugged. So I tend to notice when the model assumes everyone's the same shape. What was quiet for a moment? The Crethean texts say humans are dangerous. The Crethean texts are not wrong, Joe said cheerfully. They also say humans are unpredictable. Also not wrong. They say, what continued, very carefully, that humans are one of the few species that will deliberately approach a threat rather than evade it. That human threat response sometimes presents identically to prey-seeking behavior in other species. A pause. The texts consider this deeply alarming. Joe grinned. It was, when noted, the kind of grin that, in most predator species, preceded something bad for someone else. What do the texts say about why we do that? They have several theories. None of them fully account for the behavior. The real answer is we're curious, Joe said. We want to know what the scary thing is. If we understand it, maybe we can use it, or talk to it, or eat it. Or, and this is the one that keeps getting us in trouble, befriend it. Was cluster limbs arranged themselves into a configuration that Kalen, had he been present, might have recognized as the Crethean equivalent of being deeply unsettled and deeply intrigued simultaneously. You approach threats, was said, to potentially befriend them. Sometimes it works, Joe said, and when it doesn't, then at least we know what kind of thing we're dealing with. Kalen spent the next 4 nights restructuring 30 years of curriculum. He pulled in New York as a consultant. She had opinions about ambush hunter evasion that turned out to be highly species-specific and far more nuanced than the framework had allowed for. Me contributed, with characteristic Dorothy directness, a detailed breakdown of exactly how an ambush hunter notices it's being noticed, which was, Kalen had to admit, extraordinarily useful from a defensive standpoint. Day and High provided coordinated pursuit patterns that turned the pack evasion module into something 3 times longer and twice as useful. What provided the prey ecosystem analysis? It was, Kalen thought, the most quietly devastating document he had ever read, a species that had evolved under simultaneous pressure from 4 different predator types, each requiring a completely different response, and had developed a cluster intelligence so finely tuned that a Crethean could read a room's threat level faster than most species could blink. Joe provided nothing except the original question, which, Kalen was slowly realizing, was the most useful contribution of all. On the 5th night, Kalen added a new introductory slide to the curriculum. It read, before we discuss prey response, who, in this room, has been prey? Who has been a predator? Who has been both? The answers will determine what this class teaches you. He sent a copy to Joe. Joe's response came back in 11 minutes. Better. Also, when do we get to the part where we discuss species that don't fit either category? Kalen stared at his display for a long moment. Then he opened a new document and began to type. 30 years of curriculum. And somehow, he had never once asked himself which species he was writing it for. The human had been in his class for 8 weeks. He suspected the next 30 years were going to be considerably more interesting. Somewhere in the Crethean texts, in a section most other species skipped, there was a line that read, of all the species encountered in the outer corridors, humans remain the most difficult to classify. They are not prey. They are not quite predators. They are something older than both, something that learned to stare into the dark and ask it questions. The Crethean scholars who wrote it had meant it as a warning. Rereading it for the first time since leaving home, thought it sounded more like a compliment.